Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Welcome to today's reading from Brilliant as the Sun, Canto 6, Divine Protection, Chapter 15, Instructions from the Sages. Ukam Kavati Vachalam Pangum Langhaite Girim Yat Kripatamam Vande Shri Gurum Dev Tarinam Paramananda Madhavam Shri Chaitanya Ishwaram Hari Om. So let's continue from yesterday's reading when we left at how Chitraketu and his queen Kritadyoti were left bereaved. Verse number 1, Angira and Narad entered the queen's quarters unchallenged. The entire palace staff lined the corridors to the prince's room. They were weeping and practically unconscious with grief. The two sages found King Chitraketu lying on the floor next to his son's dead body. He lay exhausted as if dead. Angira squatted by his side. Verse 2, My dear king, you are learned and wise. It does not befit you to give in to such grief. Urged by the sage, Chitraketu gradually opened his eyes, which were bloodshot and filled with anguish. Seeing the sage, he groaned, Oh, my beloved son is dead. What am I to do? What am I to do? His voice trailed off in sobs. Angira spoke firmly, My dear king, you have no relationship with this body. Why are you grieving so? 1 year ago, the body of Harshashoka did not exist. When you leave your body, you will forget it ever existed. Therefore, on what basis do you think he is your son now? Verse 3, Chitraketu stared blankly at him. Angira persisted, Listen, Chitraketu, as particles of sands are brought together and then separated by the force of the ocean waves, souls are temporarily brought together and then separated by time. Verse 4, Chitraketu groaned and tossed, separated from my son, I am in agony. What terrible sin have I committed to suffer thus? For a long time I suffered because I had no son. Then in my old age a son was born. This too has led to great suffering. Listen, Chitraketu, said Narad, some grain seeds fructify and some do not. Sometimes the seed is sterile and sometimes the field is barren. Similarly, with humans, sometimes the father cannot conceive a child and sometimes the mother. This is all happening by Lord's will under the spell of his illusory energy. Since everything happens by his will, do not lament over these ephemeral relationships. Chitraketu continued to sob and moan in pain. Verse 5, Angira placed a hand on his shoulder. Listen to me, king. You, me, and your queens, advisors, citizens, everything moving and non-moving, all exist in a temporary situation like a dream. A dream only exists between the time we fall asleep and when we awaken. Therefore, whatever we experience in the dream, being temporary, is not reality like a dream. Our relationships in this life exist only during the brief time between our birth and death. So this is very powerful description of the relationships in life. Verse 6, that is why Krishna, the proprietor of this creation, considers our material bodies to be insignificant, like a boy playing indifferently with toys. Krishna is indifferent to this creation. He creates all material phenomena, maintains them, and then annihilates them through the agency of others. Verse 7, for example, the Lord used your body to create your sons through your queen's body. Though the body may die, the elements making up the body are eternal, and so is the soul within. Verse 8, Narad added, It is only because of ignorance that you identify the soul with the general and specific designations of the body it inhabits. Chitraketu looked confused. What do you mean? Narad said, General designations are those shared by many people, for example, being a resident of Surasena or a male. Specific designations apply to one or two people. For example, being Harshashoka's father, we identify with these labels when we are not advanced in spiritual realization. Verses 9 to 15, Chitraketu let go of his son's limp body, sat up and wiped his tears. For some moments he pondered. Angira's and Narad's words. It was true, both he and Ashoka were eternal souls. Their connection was based simply on their transient bodies. He took several deep breaths and gradually felt calmer. He looked at the two sages and said, "Although you appear like impoverished mendicants, you seem most learned. I had previously heard that exalted Vaishnava Brahmins like Sanat Kumar, Narad, Ribhu, Angira, Devala, Asita, Vyasadev, Markandeya, Gautam, Vashisht, Parshuram, Kapil, Shukadev and others wandered the earth to enlighten materialists like me. You must be one of them." Verse 16, Chitraketu folded his palms in supplication. "Because you are elevated personalities, you can give me transcendental knowledge. I am immersed in the darkness of ignorance, and therefore I am no better than the village animal, a pig or dog. I beg you to enlighten me." Verse 17, Angira smiled. "My dear king, blinded by grief, you seem not to recognize me. I am the same Angira who fulfilled your desire to have a son. As for my company, he is the great sage Narad, the direct son of Lord Brahma." Chitraketu fell flat before the sages in obeisance. They gently lifted him and assisted him to a seat. The queen too had become calmer, and with her maidservant's help, she sat near her husband and listened. The other queens and courtiers all crowded around, curious to know what the sages would say. Verses 18 and 19, Angira said, "My dear king, you are an advanced devotee of Supreme Lord. To lament for losing something material is unsuitable for one like you." Narad added, "That's why we both come here. We want to relieve you from this false lamentation which is due to the darkness of ignorance. It is not helpful for someone on the spiritual path to be so affected by worldly loss and gain." Chitraketu hung his head. Verse 20, Angira placed a hand on his shoulder. "Dear king, do you remember the first time I came to your home? I could have given you the supreme transcendental knowledge then, but you were too absorbed in worrying about the material problems. So I fulfilled your desire and gave you a son who caused you much jubilation first and now lamentation." Verses 21 to 23, Narad sat next to Chitraketu. "My dear king, now you are experiencing the misery of a person who has sons and daughters. In ignorance, we think our family members will protect us, but because they are all temporary, they end up causing our suffering. All material possessions are fleeting. Your kingdom, military power, treasury, servants, ministers, friends, relatives, everything. You will lose them all, and for that reason they are sources of fear, illusion, lamentation, and distress. They are like flower castles in the sky. They seem so real, so solid, but because they will all disappear in time, the wise consider them no better than a dream." The queen shook her head in confusion. "Flower castles in the sky do not exist, but everything you mentioned is real." The king nodded in agreement, also puzzled by the sage's instruction. The interruption did not offend Narad. It was good they raised their doubts. "You are correct, my dear queen," he said. "Your possessions exist, but an imaginary palace does not. However, everything you think you own is temporary." This is verse 24. "Like bubbles in the ocean or a passing dream, you cannot keep any of it. Therefore, they really have no more value than an imaginary flower castle in the sky. Only because of our past karmas do we claim that anything is ours. Such a sense of false ownership is simply a mental concoction, and it makes us act in ways which will further embroil us in repeated birth and death." Kritya Duti sobbed, "I do not understand. How is it false to think this is my husband and this is my son?" Verse 25. Angira said, "Dear lady, you think this way because of illusion. You are an eternal spirit soul. Only because of ignorance do you identify with this temporary body. These bodies are merely combinations of physical elements. The 5 knowledge-acquiring senses and 5 working senses along with the mind. It is the mind's false notions which oblige you to suffer these 3 types of miseries." Chitraketu asked, what are these miseries? Narad said, Adi Bhautik, or those coming from other living beings, Adi Devik, or those coming caused by our environment, and Adhyatmik, those generated by our body or mind. If we identify with the material body, we will be obliged to suffer these miseries. Chitraketu sighed. It was true. There was never uninterrupted happiness even when everything else in his life had been good. He had been deeply anguished simply because he had no son. Again he placed his palms together in supplication. My Lord, please tell me how I can be freed from this suffering. Narad looked at Angira and they both smiled, pleased by the king's question. Angira said, this is the most important question that everyone should ask. I congratulate you. In verse 26, Narad said, you must first carefully consider who you are, the body, the mind, or a soul. Narad allowed the king and queen time to think about this. He continued, then ask yourselves, where have I come from? Where will you go after death? Why am I forced to suffer material miseries against my will? Again the sage allowed these questions to register with the king and queen, and he added, by seeking answers to these important questions, you will gradually give up your attachment to your material bodies. You will also be able to give up the false belief that this world, or indeed anything which is not connected with Krishna's service, is permanent. Then you will get peace. Chitraketu became thoughtful. His son's death convinced him that anything pleasurable in this world will one day become the cause of suffering. He had heard such teaching previously, but because of material infatuation, he could not act on it. Now he was desperate for relief. Looking imploringly at the two sages, he said, please instruct me what I should do. Verse 27, Narad replied, my dear king, attentively receive from me a most auspicious mantra. By daily chanting it attentively, you will see the Supreme Lord face to face in 7 nights. Chitraketu looked at him incredulously. Verse 28, Narada assured him, formerly Lord Shiva and the other gods sought the shelter of Lord Sankarshan by reciting this mantra. They thus achieved freedom from illusion and unequal spiritual advancement. Follow my instructions and you too will soon reach the same perfection. So thank you for joining. With this we come to the end of chapter 15. Hari Om Tat Sat, Hare Krishna, and wish you all a very happy Radha Kund Appearance Day. Radha Kund Ki Jai.